cancer cures through the Biden Cancer Initiative, MD Anderson, and beyond. In this panel, or this section, we're going to focus a little bit more on the data and connecting the dots, whether it's genomic or digital health information. And then we're going to hear from three very innovative new startups in the space having applications in the cancer care continuum. So leading off our panel is David Ewing Duncan, a well-known journalist, author, data junkie himself, author of Experimental Man. He's the most sort of sequenced and data-sized person I know, who's going to introduce the panel and take us away on where the cutting edge and the future of data can take us in cancer and connecting the dots. David Ewing Duncan.
Thank you very much, Daniel. So that was an amazing panel this morning. I mean, very inspiring. And I don't know how many of you all were here, but hearing Jill Biden, you know, it does make you want to go out and basically conquer the world, or at least conquer cancer. We're going to talk in this panel. It's going to be a lot of fun, and I'm glad you all could make it. It's about what I often call the second greatest invention of humanity, okay? And that is the creation of information and, in more recent history, of data and digital data. So why do I call it the second most important invention of humanity? And by the way, we do it really well. We've gotten better and better at it. Healthcare is a little late to the game, at least in digital data, but we're certainly catching up very, very fast. And this, although you know, it is the second greatest, and the first is still kind of underway. And that is, what do we actually do with all that data? Okay, what's the, you know, how do we interpret it? What does it actually mean? And as Daniel said, I've been on my own kind of quest as a journalist and a storyteller to try to understand all of this data. And I wrote a book several years ago called Experimental Man. I basically took every test on the planet you could possibly take if you're a healthy person. And you know, not being entirely sane, I'm doing it again. And so we're doing Experimental Man 2, and I've collected far more data in the last 6 months than I collected in 10 years for the previous project. And so that's what's available out there. Now, I am fortunately a healthy person, but the idea of all this data, and we're gonna get into this. It's not just genomics. This panel was, you know, like many, or you know, at least it was, you know, said we would be focusing on genomics, which we will be, because that's obviously incredibly important. But lots and lots of other omics too, which we want to talk about a little bit: proteomics, metabolomics, et cetera. And so the idea there is, can we take this rush and flood of data, make sense of it, especially in trying to determine that place where you move from a state of healthiness to a state of disease? I mean, how far back can we go? And obviously with cancer, that's extremely important, and we're getting a little bit better at it. But you know, how do we use all of that data? So that's just a little introduction here. We're going to get into also not just the technology of this, but we have an amazing panel to talk about things that aren't technology, which are how we make sense of this in terms of, say, policy or business models. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on that. We were joking before the panel that we could actually spend a whole day on each topic that we set out to discuss here. So I'm going to stop talking and let them tell you who they are. And we'll have a few questions with the panel, and then would love to have you all chime in towards the end. So think about questions as we move towards the time when we include you. So why don't we just start?
Sure. Hi, I'm Sandeep Ban, co-founder and CEO of Prognos. I've been a digital health entrepreneur for 20 years. This is my third company. The focus of this business is really around mining clinical diagnostic information. We've built the largest data set, about 15 billion records. We're looking at about 180 million patients across 50 disease areas. So there's a vast amount of information. And we're finding some really interesting things that I want to share with you guys today.
Does he, Lynn?
Hi, I'm Lynn Hofeld. I'm with Assuragen. We're a molecular diagnostic company based in Austin, Texas. Our work in cancer is really twofold. One, developing tests and informatics around monitoring in cancer, which I think is going to become increasingly important as we talk about things around liquid biopsy, et cetera. And then also taking this just vast, complex genomic information and translating it into tests and analytics that can get a lot closer to the patient into the community hospitals.
So
Great. So
Yes.
my name is Ravinder Dhawan. I head a oncology group within an institution called Center for Observation Research and Real World Evidence within Merck. And our remit is essentially to generate evidence in addition to what we typically see in the clinical studies. So throughout the life cycle of our products, we need to sort of make sure that we generate additional evidence, which relates to all the real world evidence that we were talking earlier. So one of our mandates is to figure out a way, how do we make sense of the data that David was earlier talking about. So we got this whole vast amount of data that's coming to us from different directions. And our institution and our team is kind of mandated and to look into that and dig into that and see how we can make sense out of that. So that's part and parcel of some of that, the work we do.
Fantastic. And you can tell there's a lot of great breadths here. We have science, we have business, we have, you're working with AI. I guess everybody's working with AI, whether they are or not, right?
Yes.
A lot of hype around AI. But I wanted to start with just a sort of broad question, maybe placing us where we are, kind of in history, this long, brutal, really horrible war against cancer. And those of us who have been around, studying this, researching it, me writing about it, we keep seeming to have moments when we're turning a corner on some of the science that we're talking about here. And you had rational drug design way back when, you have personalized medicine, precision medicine, all these different terms, really trying to make oncology work better in a more precise way and really bring the science to bear. Do you all think that and there's been a lot of great progress just recently, but do you think that we're turning a corner? Is a corner in sight? I don't know who wants to start with that. And you can answer from your own perspective.
I think, I certainly do think that we are turning a corner because of all the genetics and the genomics strides we've made in the last few years. In order to understand, essentially how the genomics and genetic makeup influences the tumor growth. And the tumors are so individualized, and if we can get our sense to that, we can personalize the medicines for individual patients. So I think that is one of the biggest strides that we made in the last few years or so, which is allowing us to cater to that individualized medicine at a patient level and understanding how the different tumors that are different with different patients can influence the mutational aspect of it and how we can define different therapeutic strategies for that.
Okay. You guys want to tackle that as well?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I definitely think that we are at an inflection point, for sure. I think some of the patients that are receiving a lot of these breakthrough therapies, I think, and where it's not working, my personal belief is they're some of the last patients that will still die from cancer. But at the same time, I think they're some of the first survivors from a lot of these. That's also happening now. The question is really, what is the inflection point? Is it 5 years? Is it 15 years? That's still pretty hard to know. But from my perspective, I think we're definitely there.
Okay.
Well, and I would just add that, again, the knowledge we have today, still getting it all the way to the patient is a very long process. That's about our systems of both the regulatory system, clinical trial design, reimbursement systems. And there's some real, I think there's some real seed changes going on in those systems that are going to catch up to the acceleration that technology is providing. But it's still, getting things into clinical practice still take a very long time.
Yeah, I want to talk about all of that
Yes.
in a minute. So that's kind of a broad perspective, and you all have been doing this for a while, so I think there's some perspective there. I'm trained to be a skeptic as a journalist. We've got to, well, I don't know where we are now in the world with news, fake news, et cetera, but at least I'm an old-fashioned trained journalist. We're supposed to be skeptical of all this, but even I, having covered this for so long, there does seem to be something happening here, and it is around, especially the, targeting some of the mutations, targeted therapies. But maybe you all, Ravinder, you could start with this. Give us just a little more detail, an overview on what you're excited about in terms of new science and technology.
I think there are a couple of things. One is, of course, trying to understand how the different tumors react to the therapies and how we can sort of take from there and develop new sort of biomarkers which will allow us to do some predictive modeling, which will allow us to sort of think about how patients would behave in the future, how they would react to with the individualized medicine, how they would, how we can enhance their survival over time. So that's one of the key things which is exciting from an individualized medicine standpoint and precision medicine standpoint from the patients. The other piece is, of course, the amount of data that we are collecting, right, from a real world standpoint. And if we can bring to bear and bring that to enhance what we are actually seeing within the clinical studies, would also allow us to sort of link that not only just in the clinical study that we are seeing, but from the real world standpoint, if we can bring all together to sort of develop strategies that will allow patients to do better in the future. I think those are the two areas that I think lots happening and a very exciting area to sort of work in.
Do you think this interpretive area, or interpreting data area is part of that? I mean, obviously the biomarkers are part of that.
Yeah, we were talking earlier on this, we are collecting a ton of real world evidence and data in oncology. But it's a bit of a struggle in the sense, how do you interpret it? Because there's no standardized way of looking at the data. There's no standardized way of, at this point, how do you interpret the real world progression, for example, real world progression-free survival, the key endpoints that you typically look at. So how do you interpret all that, right? So you can look at the hard endpoints like survival and say, I can look at that, but that takes a longer period of time to get all that data into the analysis that you want to do. So those are the kinds of things that we're going to have to work on in the future. You can get some short-term insights, but for us to see how the patient outcomes are going to be in the future and from a long-term standpoint, we need to have some standardized way of looking at it. And I think we're seeing some activity in the last year and a half, where some of the agencies are coming together. Also with the Friends of Cancer, they've also taken the lead working with FDA in terms of defining some of the ways we're going to define and look at some of the endpoints. And that's something that we're going to have to work on. And then add to that the complexity of all the molecular information that we're going to be able to bring it together. Yeah.
It's a fire hose. Sure. Lynn, from your perspective, you're more in product development and on the financial side, but what are you seeing?
And I think I can add to the standardization. So, for example, one of the success stories of really TKI therapies in leukemias now requires monitoring, and people survive longer, but that means then maybe they're mobile and they're not being tested in the same environment over and over again. And so standardizing tests so that you know whether this person should go back on therapy or could come off therapy, there's great variability in the results of those testing. So even just in the treatment of patients, and as we really look to the promise of liquid biopsy, that we've got to have standards that allow people to have their data mean the same thing no matter where they're tested.
Right.
Well, and again, I want to talk a little bit more about this in a second, but it's not just about the technology, right? I mean, you have to make sense of it too. So Sandeep.
Yeah, as you said earlier, it's what we can do with the data. That's what I'm really excited about. Yeah. I think as I said, I've been in digital health for like 20 years. So if you think about why now in healthcare, a lot of the basic infrastructure just wasn't there like 20 years ago. We didn't have systems on the provider side, on the lab side, on the diagnostic company side. So a lot of those investments have been made, and a lot of this data is being collected. So that's the good news. Like if you look at electronic health records, all this stuff, it's like 90+% penetration at this point. So now what do you do with all this data? And so as the data is being collected, at the same time, there's another revolution, really a revolution happening on how you can now start to analyze it. And this is where AI comes in. And I know the term's being thrown around everywhere now, but I'll share with you guys my example of what I mean by it and how we're using it. So one is anybody that is working with data understands that it's really messy. And healthcare data is no different. It's very messy. So you have all this data being collected, siloed everywhere. It's being pulled together. So you have to first normalize all this. Because before you can run analytics on it, like I can tell you in our own data set, there are over 1 million complexities in these like 15 billion records that I talked about. To do any real analysis on it, so first thing we do is we reduce those complexities down to thousands. And I'll give you examples, like something as simple as a name of a test. You know, a BCR-ABL could be like 50 different names.
It's a breast cancer test.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So unless you can then normalize that and know it's one test, you can't really do any real analytics on it. So machine learning on that side and AI on the front end where you don't have to now ask. It used to be you would have really smart people sit there and say, okay, let's look at this population. And let's also look at all the positive results. What else did they have? So they would have to think about, let me also test this, and check to see what's in the data. What you can do now with the computational power with companies like Google and Amazon that make it available to all of us is you look at the endpoint and you say, here are diagnosed patients, confirmed diagnoses, and let the machines figure out all the correlations that lead up to that. So now that we can do that, you can start to see things if you have enough data collected, possibilities and answers that we've never imagined before. That really excites me.
I just wonder, again, kind of going through this myself with, 50 terabytes of data now or something like that. And as we said, it's not just genomics. I mean, genomics is where a lot of it starts. But there's all this other omic data. We were just talking before this about digital phenotyping, which is a new term to me anyway. It's literally, they can track how fast you're texting one day versus the other, and see a pattern that looks like maybe you're depressed or your meds aren't working or something like that. So with all of that, and knowing, by the way, even with genomics, which has been around for a while, we're still struggling to understand what some of these biomarkers mean, what the effect size is. Even in the targeted therapeutics we have, it tends to be a small percentage of each type of cancer. How do we deal with the issue of understanding the underlying science? So people like you guys and your colleagues actually, especially in the clinic, will actually trust this data.
Lynn?
Well, proving the clinical validity of the biomarkers is the big tail that you wait for to get this to people. And I think that's what we're seeing the acceleration of with large studies and data sharing. I would ask my colleagues here, we still see so much resistance of laboratories sharing any data over the cloud, letting go of any of that, big concerns about privacy. So even just accumulating, not in organized clinical trials, but in seeing other novel mutations that come up in a sequencing test, being able to share that data to people that can start to make sense of it is a critical next step. Are you seeing some movement there?
Well, it's been really our biggest struggle, has been in partnering with lots of different organizations to be able to collect data across. And there are real valid concerns. It's around privacy, it's around HIPAA laws. But technology does provide us ways to be able to do it at a patient level, yet still protect the identity of the patients. And this is not something new. We didn't invent this. I mean, these concepts have been around. We did develop some of the technology which allows us to do it. And as those barriers came up, we were able to overcome them by creating solutions around it. But I do think that I would say from my perspective, we have reached a tipping point. And where people understand by collaborating and sharing, there's more to be gained for all of us. And we heard some of the speakers earlier. I mean, at the end of the day, it's about improving health and saving lives, and that's why we're all doing what we do. And I think if you start to think about it that way, I do think that people are starting to realize. But of course, we're also all running businesses as well, and there are a lot of there are a lot of issues around people that are making a lot of money by having the data all siloed, right? And they're charging for integration, and we can go on and on about some of the stuff. But I think, yeah, I would say from our perspective, we're seeing a tipping point.
I just want to take a step back. I know that there's a lot of excitement about wearables and all that, in the non-oncology therapeutic areas, I would say, where you can collect a lot of information about your heart rate and, beats and sleeping patterns and all that, and that's easily interpretable. In oncology, it's a bit sort of complex than that. How do we get the biomarker information from wearables and some of the newer technology that we're talking about? I know, so call me skeptical or whatever, but but we need a lot of difficult road in front of us in terms of how do we get to that, collecting that information on a daily basis that allows you to sort of cater to your personalized medicine in oncology. But we are making immense strides on the biomarker side of it, and I must admit, from Merck's standpoint, we are investing heavily into the biomarker research. All of our clinical studies now have biomarker endpoints, and we're just looking into whole variety of biomarkers that would allow us to understand how patients would react to this particular biomarker. If you have an expression of biomarker, how a patient would react to a particular drug therapy that you would eventually cater to that patient. I think that's one of the key cornerstones for us. We're excited about the whole biomarker research and how we can sort of in the future bring it to bear on a more continuous way rather than looking at certain intervals. So I think we have a long road to go on, on that front.
Right. No, in fact, I mean, obviously a lot of these processes, genomics is fairly set, although you have epigenomic changes in cancer and other diseases. But whether it's the metabolome or the microbiome, I mean, that's an area we're still struggling to actually be able to capture in any kind of dynamic way. Before we leave that, I just wanted to ask you all the sort of science side of this. Are you all seeing the world of oncology moving more into these other omics that are more dynamic, and is that yet another kind of area that's just going to take a while? And I'm just wondering where we are with that, with the technology.
Well, we definitely think that's where this is going, and that looking at just DNA and RNA or just proteins is not going to be enough. Discovering kind of single gene driven disease, that's not going to be what we find next. And so we're not just combining proteomics and nucleic acid, but really looking at how we would incorporate metabolomic data, and ultimately I think microbiome will become part of it a little further down the chain because it's all immune related. And so being able to both combine all that data into a way that has analytics that can actually get to a laboratory. 80% of cancer patients are treated in the community. So we have to be able to not only make sense of this, but deliver it in a way that a general laboratory can deliver to the patients that are being treated. So this is where we're putting our R&D for the future.
I think I'll just add to that, how do we make sure that the 80% of the patients who are being treated in the community, that our community oncologists have that information available to them, right? And also they should be able to interpret that. So you get this huge genomic panel results that come to them, and if they can't figure out which gene to look for, right, and which is going to have an impact on the patients, I mean, that's a battle lost right there. So we need to make sure that there's a continuous education that we provide to our oncologists in the community. That's the only way we can have this larger and greater adoption of genomics and into the marketplace.
Yeah, I'm writing a book on robots right now, and one of them is a docbot. And I've been interviewing a lot of doctors about this, and they are actually terrified at that situation. Right. They already are. I mean, the amount of information a physician has to know now is way beyond any human. And they all talk about having, it may not be an actual like human-style robot, but some kind of device or something that's helping them interpret, all this incoming information. And their job becomes more, being the person that's, shows empathy and kind of makes the more artful decisions. But let's talk for a second about the idea of personalized or precision medicine, and they're slightly different things, but maybe even focus on, you all are all on the business side, and obviously the current pharma drug business model is about selling, you know, your drug to as many people as possible. But personalized medicine, it's always been an interesting sort of, you know, situation there, paradox, if you will, that's going to be selling possibly, you know, a personalized drug for each, maybe not each person, but it could be. You know, how do we move from our current model to that model?
I think typically when you bring in this new technology, people always think that new is more pricier, and you know, how are you going to adopt all that? So we got to take a more holistic look, right? And what holistic I mean is that you not only look at how that new test is going to affect the patient, that particular patient, but in general, how can we bring efficiencies into the system by doing that? So now you don't have to, if you're a biomarker which tells you that 60% of the patients are going to benefit from there, right? So there's a benefit for the society and a healthcare system in general. You don't have to give the therapies to 100 patients to get to those 60. Now you can cater to those 60 and get to those 60 right away. If we can get to that stage, I think it's a win-win situation for all the participants. And that's the model that I think would be eventually successful.
Yeah, I mean, I think going back to, Ravinder, you said this already, and we're looking at it, I'll share an anecdotal example from the data side. You know, I think education, if you think about most doctors that are practicing, we're talking about cancer, most oncologists, I mean, they were probably trained like 20 years ago. Yeah. You know, and think about the way and how much innovation and how much change is happening every day, every year. So, you know, we look at data, and a lot of times we'll see even the tests. First of all, you know, I spend a lot of time with diagnostics companies, pharma companies, and one of the things you hear constantly is the need for more testing. And it doesn't still happen. So we can look at like how much, you know, there's such a huge gap there. But even when, I'm amazed to see when the testing is happening, most times these oncologists, they don't even wait for the results to come in. Yeah. And they'll start the patient on chemo like right away. Mm-hmm. And so I think talk about the education, so that, I think those are still real barriers that we have to overcome. But at the same time, you know, it's pretty exciting. The FDA approved the first drug last year based on a biomarker. So it doesn't matter if it's breast cancer, lung cancer. So we're starting to see that also at the same time. But I think to get the adoption, the education and training is going to be key. And I'm with you. I think it's going to be some sort of a bot, and I don't think it's going to be that far in the future because it's too much information for any one human to absorb.
And I think on that front, I'm a bit more optimistic in the sense that if you look at about 2 years ago, for example, in the PD-L1 testing, mm-hmm. right, for biomarker testing, it used to be on average 21 days or 23 days that a patient would get the results back, so which could be eternity for a cancer patient. Right, so now that timing when you get the results back is less than 10 days now. Yeah. So we are making strides. The technologies are improving, and the way you are getting all those results back, and that could have a significant influence on how we treat patients in the future. So as the technology is improving, yep. we are reducing the timing. I mean, that's going to change the way we operate. Yeah.
And I think there's been a definite turn to the acceptance of companion diagnostics as a reality of drug trials, and which may narrow the patient population, but definitely increase the probability of success of finding the right patients. And so, you know, I think what you highlighted was a resistance, but that resistance, I think, is now a new reality of that there will be a biomarker strategy with each drug will target.
Yeah, and I mean, I've done articles on a couple of targeted therapies, and not anything from Merck, although you guys have them, but when they work, and there's all too few of them, it's really quite extraordinary. Yeah. And you know, especially a younger person, if you can have them go into, you know, quick remission and, you know, live a normal lifespan, I don't think anybody's got a big problem with paying, you know, whatever it takes to make that happen, really. I mean, in a wealthy society like ours. But let's, by the way, there's a couple more minutes here. We're going to chat, and if you all have any questions, if you want to line up by the mic there. We'll do that in a couple of minutes. We did promise to get a little bit to, although we've talked about it some, about policy. And I'll just jump into a sort of, question that we all think about, which is what's going on in Washington. No, not all that, but what's going on at the FDA and in the kind of health establishment there, and how that sort of situation, and it's everything from what Lynn said about standards to, we have a relatively new FDA commissioner, Scott Gottlieb. How are you all seeing that whole framework, the policy, regulation, standards framework? Is it keeping up? Is that a problem? Is it helping? Where are we with that?
Well, I would definitely say it's working to catch up. So I think Dr. Gottlieb's goal at the FDA is to really modernize the approach to both drug trials and diagnostics. We've firsthand witnessed a new openness to novel ways to get new diagnostic tests cleared. And through the regulatory process, I think he's very much focused on a rational set of regulations around lab-developed tests. And I think the interesting thing of both he and the new HHS secretary they're going to push for value-based systems. And I think that will generate innovation, because if you move away from procedural-based, which again, some of the reality of resistance of the way we change in care is that there's a professional fee. So that's the robot problem, right? And going towards really an outcome-based system is what will drive a change in behavior and development and innovation. And I think they're both speaking quite boldly about making that a reality. So it's encouraging.
I mean, I do see a lot of pragmatism on that front for sure. Excuse me. If you look at the Center for the Oncology Center of Excellence, right, in the last 1 year, the kind of strides they have made, particularly what you see under the leadership of Dr. Pazder over there, right, in terms of finding ways to recruit patients from the community and working on the inclusion criteria to recruit patients for clinical studies, focusing now on the real-world evidence, and they are actually starting a work stream to look at that. How do we capture patient outcomes data, patient-reported outcomes data, which is also going to be key in the future, so that we just not focus on prolonging life, but also prolonging life with some quality of life. So all those adaptive clinical designs where they're openness to sort of have this clinical trials from phase 1, 2, 3, all kind of seamless trial designs. So a lot of interesting and futuristic stuff that they're trying to adapt, which is really a healthy sign and a positive sign.
Yeah, I was at an event on Tuesday where Dr. Gottlieb came and spoke to diagnostic company CEOs. I was really encouraged by what I heard. I think his vision, he's a clinician, this is his third time at the FDA. He's also worked with the industry. And so I think he gets it. I think a lot of stuff, early signs, we've seen some of the stuff that Lynn just talked about. They have a role to play. Obviously, they want to make sure that therapies are safe and efficacious. And I mean, that right there can become a barrier to innovation. So I think, how do you do that in a way where you don't impede the innovation, but at the same time make sure that whatever you're putting out there is safe? So, I'm cautiously optimistic to see how quickly some of the stuff that he talked about will actually become reality. But
it's very interesting. I mean, they just approved the first consumer BRCA test for breast cancer, which is sort of almost surprising. I mean, that the FDA really kind of fought that for a long time. But anyway, we have a question back there. And anybody else who has questions, please line up if you will.
So enjoy the conversation. Kim Gandy for Play It Health. And I love the opinions about value-based care and about the care for the underserved that have been in the last two sort of panel sort of sessions. I wondered if you guys could talk about a way of calculating the effect that having more data from the entirety of the population, in other words, including data from the underserved, in other words, making that data more available, how that could be calculated to enhance the kinetics of when we find some of these answers. So in other words, hey, you've got twice as much data, we can get to this answer. And so Can you make any sort of assessments about if that would have an effect? Because it seems like that could be a data set that one could use to sort of, move the needle for more equitable care.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I won't say just more data is always better. I think if it's structured and normalized the right way, then more data is better. So when you apply machine learning or AI, when you actually are looking for the answers, the more you can feed into it, the better. So I think if there are opportunities to get access to that through some partnerships, programs that can be created, I think that could be really valuable. The other thing is that even at an individual level, I mean, we've had a lot of examples where you've had patients that have done really well, let's say, on some cocktail therapy, right? And complete response, and we have no idea why. So it's also an opportunity to go back in those cases and then study the data. And we found biomarkers. This happened in bladder cancer with RAD50, which is now a biomarker, which would have never discovered. But since we can see the outcome, you can go back and then look at the genomics for this patient and look for that mutation and develop a biomarker. Then you develop a test, therapy. So I don't think it's just about having, of course it's better to have broader set, but even for an individual, it could be pretty powerful.
Anybody else? Yeah. There's also the whole issue of patient-generated data, which is pretty fascinating. And, companies like Patients Like Me. And I was involved with a meeting in Washington last year where several senior people from the FDA and others were there, and how to integrate patient-generated data. So there's so many sources of data. Anyway, another question?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Laura Lynn from Row Analytics. And you look at the data that's available from 23andMe, Patients Like Me, AACR, Project Genome, Breast Cancer Now. I mean, there's a lot of these data sets. Of course, as a startup, we struggle to get access to them, but that's another story. But we look at all of the data, and my question for the panel is, are we asking the wrong questions? Maybe we need to reframe how we are trying to go about our research and the kinds of analytics and the tools and the questions that we're asking, because from our perspective, there are gobs of data, but we're not asking the right questions of that data. Comments?
Yeah, I think you're right in a way. We need to sort of start thinking about what is the most meaningful data that's going to help us move the needle on better care for cancer patients. We're collecting just unintentionally a whole bunch of data, but we're not making sense of that. So if you ask the right question, so if you're looking at individualized medicine, what would be the most important question to see how it is going to impact their short-term and long-term outcomes? Well, we're not collecting the outcomes data in a systematic way. So we've got this big sort of issue within oncology data sets. You have a structured side of the data and you have an unstructured side of the data. So the structured side of the data is basically collects the minimum amount of information and very basic parameters. And you can't make not much sense out of that. And most of the juicy stuff is in the unstructured side of it. And that's where you need to sort of employ a whole army of people eventually to go back into your EMR systems to dig all that information and start to make sense out of that. So how can we bring some standardization? How can we do further validation of that data, which, for example, the AI is now picking up from a machine learning standpoint? Can we make sense of that, right? So there's a lot of investment, a lot of stuff that needs to get done. And standardization, validation of that, I think then we would start to make some sense of that data that we're looking for. Because we have to change the questions, the research questions, and then cater to that depending on where we need to sort of collect the data.
No, it's pretty fascinating. I mean, in fact, I might even add who gets to ask the questions.
Yeah.
I mean, it's probably a whole range of people, but I think part of that is, again, patients aren't listened to that much, and there's always these breakdowns too in the progression where, the science, you spend all this time and money creating a treatment, and then the patient's treated, and then there's no real follow-through.
Right.
And some oncologists complain to me, there's no, they have to report if something goes bad, but not when something goes well.
Right.
And so, every oncologist is having to sometimes learn these things for themselves. But yes.
I think,
Hi.
no.
That just to transfer what you said. For example, one of the customers we're working with is a male infertility company, tens of thousands of clients,
And they don't ask the question, have you conceived? Yet they're coming to this service to try to help with their infertility. So
Yeah.
We've got to do better and sort of take it all the way.
Right.
Hi, thank you for your time today. In the previous panel, one of the panelists talked about the importance of mental health, particularly in helping cancer. And we're talking now about data, and David, you even talked about digital biomarkers that can give indicators of depression and behavioral health. And in fact, that's one of the areas where there's a lot of unstructured data as well, and that's some of the stuff that my company, Lightsprite, works on. But what I'm really curious about is the integration of this new type of patient information that we've had. If you have a patient journaling about what they're upset about, or if they're meditating or doing visualization, have clinical assessments that are coming in that way, how does it integrate with some of the more traditional types of data that you do collect as part of drug discovery? Because in the primary care area, we talk about integrating behavioral health, right, and integrated care. Can we do that with data? And then how does that deliver outcomes?
It's pretty fascinating. I mean, it's something I've been writing about off and on for several years, and it gets partly to the question of how do you integrate these three great pillars in our society, which is health, IT, and biomedicine. And I've even formed this little group called Arc Fusion, and we hold meetings and try to bring these communities together. But maybe, asking you all how do you integrate what's, in my Fitbit here with, say, treatment for oncology?
I think there are a number of new, smaller companies which are popping up, which are basically taking on this sort of stuff of integration. We've been, from Merck's standpoint, we've invested in a couple of them. Synapse is one of those which is trying to bring different sort of aspects of all that data into one integrated framework, which could be usable by patients and by clinicians and by different stakeholders. So I think that's going to grow over time. There's no question about it. And a lot of people are looking at how do we sort of bring it all together in an integrated fashion.
And I would just add the concept of interrogating cancer has still been so difficult through scans and biopsies, and so this new era of liquid biopsy as a way to continuously monitor what's happening with people's cancer. This is a very exciting new set of data that's going to become a reality. That linking that to the progression of the disease is such an important moment, and companies like Grail and others that are doing this work. That's like the new wave of data that I think is really going to drive different outcomes.
I imagine if your Apple Watch can measure the circulating tumor cells in your blood, right? Just a little pinch, and you can. Where would that take us?
So David, I'll ask the
Let me
last.
ask a bit of a follow-up on that, which is, I mean, we've had, you've got all of the big IT companies are desperate to break into the $3 or $4 trillion American healthcare market, not to mention the world. And they've fumbled here and there, one might say. But are you all working with Google, with Facebook, with other companies that are collecting health data or trying to collect it? Is that reached the level of what you all are doing in developing?
We are. I mean, we've got several. I've got a couple of colleagues here. They are solely focused on that in terms of looking into how we can integrate all that with different non sort of cancer companies and even outside the biotech arena with Googles of the world, and of course in some of the other companies who are just in that business of bringing everything together. So yeah, there's a tremendous effort. Of course, at an industry level, we've got a whole digital transformational sort of initiative going on within the company. So we're going to take it to a different level.
So you have a direct line to Larry Page, or so one more. We have time for one more question.
Hi, I'm Vicki Binger. I'm the president of the Coalition Against Childhood Cancer, and I represent 100 pediatric cancer foundations across the country and outside the country. And 60% of children are on clinical trials compared to what we learned this morning, about 5% of adults. And yet we don't seem to get a lot of interest because we're protecting children in dealing with the uniqueness in that particular population and rare cancers, but particularly pediatric patients who seem to get protected and their privacy protected because they don't have the volition to sign consent and so forth. They're also going to have a lot longer surveillance if they become survivors. Have you been thinking about data collection from the pediatric populations?
Yeah, I mean, that's something from our standpoint. We're investing quite a bit in terms of doing pediatric studies to begin with, a pediatrics clinical trial. And then collecting that data, I think that would come naturally from there, because I don't think we are there yet from a real world standpoint to collect the data.
Well, certainly, we haven't had a huge number of industry-sponsored clinical trials in pediatrics. It's mainly Children Oncology Group, NCI funded, and private funders as opposed to industry sponsors. So I don't think we're there yet, even as we're getting some movement by some of the more strategic companies.
Great. Well, let's give our panel a hand here.
So, thanks to the panel, and don't go anywhere because you're asking the Q&A for the next section. And since I'm a pediatric oncologist, one element I'll mention is that a lot of lessons that we've learned from getting all these kids in trials should be applied to the adult world, where very few are on trials. And the last piece is about all this data, but aligning the incentives to share it. I was talking to Dr. Bister, the new president of MD Anderson. How do you change, how you reward an academic for sharing a data set, or for getting tenure? A lot of ways to align, including from pharma companies to share negative trials, and EMR companies and patient groups. So like we use Google Maps today to share data when we drive, that kind of same element can come to healthcare. So we're going to run to the last part of this session. We're going to hear from three pretty cool new startups that are addressing and can apply their talents in cancer in different ways, from building apps to crowdsourcing data and keeping it safe, to personalizing the user interface. They're going to have 1 minute to sort of pitch and tell you what they're doing, and the panel will have 2 minutes to answer some quick questions back and forth. So we're going to start off with the founder and CEO of Open Health Network.
Hi, my name is Tatiana Kanzaveli, and I'm the founder and CEO of Open Health Network. 5 years ago, when I was diagnosed with colon cancer, I had lots of questions and totally can relate to everything that was told on the first panel and what you guys just talked about. And one of the key things that bugged me at that time and still bugging me, no one could give you an answer, why me? And I realized that there are a lot of data that can be collected, such as genomics and everything else. I couldn't blame my parents. They did tissue analysis. It's not me. So I decided to build a company that will allow to collect and integrate all the other data, 360 degrees of data that can impact causation, treatment, outcome of cancer and other diseases. And I knew as a patient that the last thing I wanted at that time, someone to come to me and say, give me your data, give me your data. No, you need to provide value to patients. You need to provide a place for patients to come and do everything in one place. They can't use 10,000 apps, 10,000 chatbots. It has to be personalized. I don't want to learn about any type of colon cancer. I want to get what I need. Now, patients who have cancers, they're older patients. They have other diseases. Why are you not looking at how other diseases and other treatments impact everything else? So I started this company when I was diagnosed with cancer to bring all those solutions to people, and we built why patients can be rewarded for sharing data, So we built blockchain-enabled health data exchange platform where we can ask people, share data, and you will get paid, and you will control who and how uses that data. So I'm happy to be here and thrilled to listen to all of you and answer your questions.
Quick questions from the panel.
I'm wondering what kind of reception you're getting, especially with people like on our panel.
Right, because we've been lucky enough to deploy solutions for such organizations as American Heart Association, and I can tell you the design piece, it's all about patients. So if you focus on design and make it extremely usable for patients, we have 60% repeat users on the app, on My Cardiac Coach. They spend 5 minutes every time they open an app. Why? Because they come to one place, they can contribute their data, it's personalized, they can do everything from appointment to medication reminder to tracking their lifestyle, nutrition will be added. And you see what I mean? So if you make it really with patient in mind, you can make it happen.
Are we allowed to
One more,
ask one?
quick.
How many patients are using it right now?
So the first version that's out there for My Cardio Coach is geared towards people who had heart attack, and the goal is to prevent them having repeated heart attack. So right now, it's I think 10,000, and it's growing like thousands a day. Like literally, it's like lots of data. Yeah.
That's great.
So bottom line, you're democratizing the ability to build apps on the fly for a variety of applications.
Collect and analyze. We build also everything in between, such as adaptive care plans, because no one understands what happens in between. Like I can tell you, I went after the surgery, I came back in 7 days. The next time they looked at me, it was a year after. And what happens in between? So we build AI models that actually create adaptive care plan and data capturing in between, so we avoid certain situations. So anyways, yeah.
Thanks, Tatiana.
Thank you.
And for all the companies, go online, check them out, try using these platforms and using them yourselves. So next up is the CEO and founder of Play It Health, Kim Gandy, who I actually know from we were in the lab at Stanford back in the day, and who's now applying her skills in a very unique way. Kim.
Thank you very much, Daniel. So my name is Kim Gandy. I'm founder and CEO of Play It Health. We track, score, and incentivize adherence to prescribed regimens through remote patient monitoring in a way that, as of the last 2 weeks of December, is now reimbursable. I was previously a pediatric heart and transplant surgeon and a stem cell biologist. And we could design or go through the Hail Mary of transplants or design the most elegant therapies, but if we couldn't get patients to follow those therapies, then it wasn't going to work. And we were losing kids in my particular area. So our platform tracks adherence to personalized education, appointments, all these linked devices, including did they use their digital glucometer, blood pressure cuff, scale, activity tracker, track adherence to medications and nutrition, and we create a score that can then be used to incentivize and stratify patients. Our unique scoring engine and the fact that we have the ability to cover 20 different chronic conditions allow us to be of appeal to not only employers, to organizations, not only their employees, but also their patients. Patients like us because we make them feel special as they move through and beyond their chronic conditions. And I should know, I'm actually a 3-cancer survivor. And similarly, clinicians like us because as they improve outcomes, decrease admissions, and decrease complications, they can make and save money. Thank you very much.
So, quick question, what patient experience has been so far in terms of the adherence and going back and filling out, obviously they're tracking their adherence, right?
Correct.
Right.
And so our pre-pilot at Duke demonstrated unequivocal adoption of the platform by both clinicians and patients, and they universally endorsed the platform. We now have 300 active users in the program, and we're accumulating that long-term data with adherence. To be honest with you, this change in this coding has just entirely opened up our world. So we went from being able to approach 1,000 patients in all of 2016 and 17 to now having access to 1.4 million within the last 2 months. And so I don't know how much that's been talked about at this particular sort of conference, but that sort of alignment of incentives is something that that always allows us to move forward. That's what moved EHRs forward. That's what gave you guys the data that you're talking about today. And I think that's what's going to bring a lot of this data that I'm talking about to bear to be able to overlay yours. Because, like I said, coming at this from a variety of different areas, right. I have a personal bias, both as a scientist and as a patient, that I think some of the things like tracking their activity, tracking whether they adhere to these therapies that we're already prescribing, the long-term anti-hormonal therapies, for an instance, I think that's going to have just as much impact as a lot of the new cutting-edge things that we're doing. So I think we have to look at everything.
And typically what you see is that you will see adherence very high initially, and then it kind of tapers off.
Yeah, and our platform is beautifully designed to dynamically follow them, so that's the whole thing. And we actually also have in-app telehealth or virtual visit sort of capacity within our system. And so we are following patients as they fall off, so it's not just after you've lost them. We know the data that if you're following after you've lost them, and if it's 30 days, then you're not going to get them back. So the idea, dynamically follow them, catch them as they're before they fall off the map.
Okay.
Great. And last, I'll make one little element in here. All this still needs to be part of the workflow of the patient and the clinician. How do you connect your app? How do you let it be prescribed? How does the data flow back to the caregiver?
Yes, so those are beautiful questions, and since we're working in so many different scenarios, because our app is being used in a lot of different areas, it varies. But within hospitals, we have groups that we're either interfacing with their EHR or with the pharmacy system that they use, or even with health information exchanges in some areas. I know they don't work everywhere, but they do work in some. And we happen to be in a belt of health information exchanges that work, that move from Denver all the way over to St. Louis. And so we are leveraging that ability to sort of bring some of that data and integrate it into the workflows. And many actually are, because we do believe in clinical trials, we're doing a lot of clinical trials where those clinicians like to enter that data themselves.
Thank you, Dr. Gandy.
Great.
All right. And last but not least, Brian's going to tell us about how one of the big buzzwords here at South by Southwest, blockchain, can be applied in very creative ways in cancer.
Thank you much. My name is Brian Minnell. I'm a technology entrepreneur. I've sold 3 companies in the past and had 1 IPO. And honestly, what we're doing at Veramos, I think, has more potential than all those companies combined. So we're taking all the environmental data around what we're doing, all the things from our smart watches, our sleep, our activity, nutrition, all those things, and we collect all that data and we give people, we want to take that and put it on the blockchain. So we give people tokens, in essence, that represent their data in the protocol. And then as we find more uses for that environmental data out in industry, and all the things we talked about here, we believe that the protocol will grow in value, the tokens will grow in value, and that will reward the people that hold the tokens themselves. So blockchain gives us a way to have the data be private and for people to own their own wellness record, for instance. So we're trying to build nothing less than the world's largest repository of ambulatory data out there, and that's actually owned by collectively all of us. So, thank you very much. 1 minute, I did it.
Yes.
So
Bitcoin
is
for
this
you.
more about collecting data or more about how you transfer?
Well, none of this really is possible without blockchain in terms of like having people own their data.
Right.
Blockchain means it's distributed across hundreds of computers around the world, so no one person owns it or controls it, right? Which I think, people are tired of organizations like the Google and Microsoft like owning all of our data just to sell it back to us. This is a way to decentralize that whole model, right? So we own it, we control it, and we benefit from it, from the values of our tokens growing.
So this is an emerging area of business. How are you going to differentiate in this busy space?
There's a lot. So everybody's trying to decentralize everything in the world right now, right? When we looked at data out there, there's tons of data around the critical care stuff, courtesy of Medicare and Medicaid and pharma and things like that. We couldn't find a lot of really great data sets in ambulatory, all our environmental data. But I think it's really critical that sort of supports and helps healthcare, right? So there's lots of folks doing it, but it's still very early. The tools are very rough, so we'll see.
Can you talk a little bit about how do you envision partnering with industry? So somebody that wants to have access to this kind of data, how do you see that happening?
Yeah, for sure. So like in our app, for instance, we ask people questions about themselves so we know more about them, besides just the data we collect on their sleep and nutrition, those sorts of things. So potentially we could find a great candidates for a clinical trial, perhaps, right? Really precise things we know about them, their activity, what they do, how active they are, what they eat, those sorts of things. So I think pharma could benefit as well too. I was talking with folks from MD Anderson about how can we make sure people are prepared for coming in for maybe a cancer therapy, right? They have the right level of hydration, diet, sleep, whatever is required for that therapy to be valuable and not be canceled, maybe a reschedule or something like that. So we have about 8 major use cases for the data that we found.
Great.
And I'll close the last question. How do you incentivize individuals to be data donors and maybe even be rewarded for sharing it?
Right, so right now there's a little bit of a sort of a crypto craze going on with the sort of people, the Bitcoin market, right? So people are doing all sorts of crazy things for tokens, and so we want to capitalize on that now, right? And then also find ways that people may get tokens for doing things they do anyway. So if I order healthy food from a Snap Kitchen or some place where I get food, maybe I can use those tokens to go take a yoga class or something else that benefits my wellness. So hopefully it'll create an economy and people will just, create more sort of utility of what people do with the tokens over time. through our partner. So.
All right. Thank you, Brian, and
Thank you.
And Veramos, and the rest of the startups and the panel. I think we had a great Connect to End session here. We're going to be back in 30 minutes for Connect to Cancer session number 3. We're going to have an amazing panel with Esther Dyson, folks from American Cancer Society, and several startups looking at how we apply AI, machine learning, connect the dots, and really move cancer to history. See you back in 30 minutes.